Today's story is a classic, don't go in the woods type of story, but before we get into today's story, if you're a fan horror, dark, and mysterious stories and real events, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. We upload 2 or 3 times every week, so if that's of interest to you, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following: the country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoors men and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous, and it's right in the middle of the Northwest Territories. It's this 11,000 square mile stretch of just pure wilderness that's called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was made into a national park, but don't let that fool you, this is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, so there's no hotels. There's really nothing inside of it, and there are no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane or by boat or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man. It is really nature at its purest form. However, there is a catch: this valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe that literally overnight just vanished, leaving behind their shelters, their food, their supplies, just gone. No one knows what happened to them, or the tribes have abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying, real events, and they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribespeople have about this. The native tribespeople have stories about the Nahanni Valley where something evil is said to be lurking in the forest, though it is not known what it is. In 1904, 3 brothers named Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who lived in the Northwest Territories, decided to search for gold in the valley. They believed that because so few people had ever been there, if there was gold to be found, it had not been found yet. After a long and difficult journey using sled dogs, trains, and homemade boats, they finally made it into the valley and found themselves on the Flat River, which runs through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Despite its name, the Flat River is actually more like a rapid at certain points. The 3 brothers made their way up the river on their boat until they eventually pulled off onto the riverbank and set up their camp. The 3 brothers put their gold sluices in the river to trap gold nuggets inside. A gold sluice is a long, skinny box that is usually made of wood and has a strainer on one side. Gold miners put it in the water submerged, and they will shovel the sediment on the bottom of the water into this little funnel. The big stuff will get stopped by the strainer, and the dirt and water will just kind of flow out the side. The idea is to trap gold nuggets inside of the sluice. The 3 brothers got their sluices up and started looking for gold. Right away, they hit pay dirt. There was tons of gold in this river, and so all day and all night, they got all this gold. The next morning they did the same thing, and by the time all their containers were literally filled to the brim with gold, they decided to go back and turn this in and get some money for it, and then come back out here. They packed up their tent, all their supplies, and they put everything back in their boat. At some point, very early on in their journey back, the boat capsized, and the boat actually broke apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. The boat actually just sank, and much of their supplies, including all of their gold, sunk. But the 3 brothers were able to grab some of their supplies, like the rifle and some lumber and some of their mining supplies, and they swam it all to shore. They caught their breath, and they were totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they were alive, and they had enough supplies to survive. They figured all they could do was maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they did still have a sluice, and then try to get out of there and regroup and come back another time. Using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat and then also by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat, and then hopped back on the flat river, and they went back up to that site where they had found gold earlier. They set up their sluice, they set up their camp again, and this time, they didn't find any gold. So, all day this very disappointing day that they had already lost all their gold, now they were not finding any more gold, and so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just gonna leave. The next day, they got up, they packed up, they hopped back on the flat river on this new boat they had built, and they were able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they got back home, the two younger brothers Willie and Frank started talking about how they wanted to go back into Nahanni Valley and go get more gold because now they knew there was gold out there, it's not a question. Charlie, the older brother, wanted to get the gold, but he felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so he actually decided not to go, and the two younger brothers could go if they wanted to. Several months goes by and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation for this additional trip into the valley, and finally in 1905 they're ready, and so Willie, Frank, and a third man called Robert Weir, who was a friend of theirs, was going to replace Charlie. The three of them make their way up into the valley. Now they didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, and so when they didn't send any word and no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned because he knew there was lots of gold to be had out in the Nahanni Valley, and so he figured they must have struck it rich and now they've decided to live out their long term, or at least maybe through the summer or maybe the next year, and so he wasn't concerned, and because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. Weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one's heard from these three men, no one's heard from Willie, Frank, or from Robert, but still Charlie maintains that nothing can be wrong because there's three of them out there, they're incredibly experienced, there is a ton of gold out there, I'm sure they're just killing it, and they're just acquiring all this gold, and we're gonna see them in the next couple of months maybe and everything's gonna be just fine, but a whole other year would go by, so they've been out there for 2 years and no one has heard from them, and at this point, Charlie thinks to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. And so he rounds up 4 other people from his town and he mounts an expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to go find his 2 brothers and find Robert Weir. Charlie, in a search party, eventually, after yet another long and arduous journey, they get into Nahanni Valley, and they get onto the Flat River, and so they start making their way upstream along Flat River. The whole time they're scanning the left and the right side hoping to see some sign of life. They're looking for any indication that these 3 men are out here and just fine, but they didn't see any sign of them. And so they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, or I should say the very beginning of Flat River, where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River, and once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream. Again they're looking on either side for any sign of these 3 men, there's no sign of them, and then the river they're on takes a very sharp turn, it's actually called the Big Bend, and it's about a 45-degree turn, and as soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Along South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through, and they're labeled 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon, and these canyons are massive. 2nd Canyon is unique because the cliff faces are as sheer as you're gonna get, and the cliff face is almost but up exactly up against the water, so there's really very little shoreline on either side, so once you're in this 10-mile stretch you're basically boxed and you have thousands of feet of. There are massive cliffs on either side of the water, and to get through this section of the river, which has no shorelines, you must pass along the cliffs. There are openings to massive cave systems high up on both sides of the cliffs, but nobody has gone inside because it is challenging to get there. The search party enters Second Canyon, where it becomes dark and windy, and the shoreline is barely big enough for a boat to land. As they get closer to First Canyon, they notice a tent perched within some trees on the left-hand side. There is a body outside the tent with no head, and the clothes are burned. The second body is badly decomposed and also missing its head, positioned partly inside and partly outside of the tent. The search party searches the camp for the missing heads but cannot find them. They do find some personal effects of the 2 people. Inside the tent, it was confirmed that the 2 decapitated bodies were the brothers of Charlie. However, Robert Weir, the 3rd man who was with them, was not found at the campsite and was never found officially. Later, a partial skeleton that was found a little way down the river several months later was attributed to Robert, but it was not 100% confirmed to be his. The only other thing found at the campsite was a carving in a nearby tree that read, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that the brothers had found gold, but no gold was found on them or in their camp or in the nearby river. Charlie and a search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would launch an investigation and ultimately conclude that all 3 men had starved to death and that animals had taken them away after they perished, which was why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls of the 2 brothers were missing. However, Charlie believed that they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police disagreed, saying that it was a natural occurrence. The news of the 2 decapitated men caused a great stir and divided people into 2 groups, one that believed Robert had murdered the 2 brothers and taken their gold, and another that believed all 3 men had been attacked by something horrifying. Despite the obvious gold prospects in the Headless Valley and along the South Nahanni River and the Flat River, people were too terrified to risk going in and potentially becoming another victim. The Headless Valley became the name of the stretch where the 2 brothers had been found, and people stayed away from the Nahanni Valley, at least until 8 years later in 1913 when a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided to take gold out of the Nahanni Valley, despite the scary stories about headless men, ghosts, and killers on the loose. I'm not going to let any of that get in the way of me taking gold out of Nahanni Valley. All on his own, Martin made the arduous trek inside of Nahanni Valley. He made his way up Flat River and finally found a spot about 70 miles upstream of where Headless Valley was. He actually built a 1-room cabin because he was going to stay there through the winter, and then the plan was he would meet up with his partners the following summer. Right after he got there, he set up his sluices and started mining for gold. Apparently, he found a lot of it because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had made it rich. So his partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he got because they planned on going back into the valley with him. During the summer, Martin's partners went to the meeting spot outside the Nahanni Valley at 5 p.m., but Martin never showed up. They waited there for several days until they decided to look for him. They made their way to the area where he was staying and found his cabin burned to the ground, with the burned-out remains of another headless corpse next to it. The corpse was identified as Martin's, but the police were unable to determine the cause of his death. They did not connect his death to the McLeod brothers' deaths, even though they were all decapitated and the incidents occurred within a few years of each other. Despite the police's assurance, people assumed there was a killer on the loose in the Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner set up camp in Headless Valley not far from where the McLeod brothers were found. John went out to check their traps but never returned. His partner went out looking for him with another prospector and found him frozen to death. It was very interesting the way he was positioned. He was sitting in front of this obviously previously lit campfire. He wasn't hunched over, and he didn't look like he was in pain. He looked like he was just enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even holding the matchbook in his hand. It was like he was just sitting there enjoying the fire when something caused him to suddenly freeze. In fact, witnesses would say John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. The police, when they came out, would say this is odd, the way he's positioned, but ultimately he died because he froze to death, and so there's no foul play here, and no further investigation is needed. 5 years later in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. That night, they're all kind of joking around the fire, and then at some point they decide to all go to sleep. The next day, when everybody gets up, Annie is no longer in camp. There's no sign of where she went. So, they begin by yelling out and walking around the immediate vicinity to see maybe if she stepped away for a minute, but Annie's just gone, and no one knows where she went. The hunting party spends the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there's no sign of her. They ultimately leave the valley, and they tell police. Police come out, and there's this huge search, but Annie's never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party, he didn't know Annie, he was just in the vicinity, overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman going missing, and when he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. He goes to police and he explains that that night, when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he could hear them, he knew they were over there. He said at some point he went to bed, and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge, so he sits up and he looks out across the river. It's totally dark, but there's some moonlight, and he's kind of looking around wondering what's causing the sound, but he can't see it. Then he hears it again, and he can tell it's off to his left, And these are not huge rocks, these are like medium to small-sized rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. And so he's looking, and all of a sudden he sees, maybe a couple hundred yards away through some sparse trees, he sees a naked woman, a white naked woman, running on all fours up this mountainside. And as she's running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands are knocking little rocks into the river down below. She's right on the edge of this cliff, and as she's running up this hill, she stops and she turns, and he gets a good look at her face, and Charlie would say, he was so taken aback by her face, it looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face, and so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her, even though he knew anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds is doomed. But he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something wrong with this woman. And so the police, they take the story down and they say, hey, you know, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description. And so universally it's believed this woman galloping up this hillside in the middle of the night naked was Annie. The police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further, because at the time Charlie was telling them this piece of information, she had already been gone for months, and the assumption was she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decides to try their luck in Headless Valley. A man named Phil Powers, he makes his way into the valley. He finds a spot off a flat river. He builds a cabin, and then shortly thereafter his cabin burns to the ground, with him inside of it. Now his skeleton was intact, but the strange thing about his death is based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof. He should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down, giving rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was just all one big accident. But the vast majority of people that have followed along to this point with all of these strange deaths, they were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, they entered the Headless Valley to try their luck, and shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers, it had burned to the ground. But William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector named Ernest Savard entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold, and then when he did not leave the valley for an intended rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him, and they would find him inside of a sleeping bag, laying down decapitated right along the flat river inside of the Headless Valley. And so the police would come out. They would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident, where he starved to death or he died of hypothermia, and then after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, and that's why we can't find it. And so the police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley, and he went missing. And so the search party went in looking for him, and John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near Flat River. Some native tribes people came into their camp, and they warned them about some white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They're down near the river, they're out in the forest, they're kind of all around here, and so you really need to be careful. You don't want them to see you. And then these tribes people just left, and so the search party is absolutely horrified. They know about the rumors of this place. They're out here looking for someone that's gone missing in this place, and all night all they hear are distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard in the previous nights. They're hearing these wailing sounds coming from all around them, like these things that are out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing when they got up and they left, the leader of that search party would say he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister, and that constant wailing they heard the night before, he said he will never forget. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far less strange incidents reported inside of Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far less people have been going into Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s, and in recent times huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park, but other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley, and the truth is nobody knows why.